Hi and welcome. I'm Andy Mioch and you are watching A News. Let's have a look at the headlines. Iran's military mocks Trump's claims of ceasefire talks as Washington puts forward a 15-point plan to end the war. Danish Prime Minister's future unclear after left-wing bloc fails to win majority. And humanitarian aid arrives in Cuba as the country faces a deepening energy crisis. Thank you for tuning in. We start with the latest out of the Middle East war. Israel and Iran exchanged fresh airstrikes as Iran's military denied negotiations are underway with the United States to end the war. Iran's Joint Military Command spokesperson said the United States is, quote, negotiating with itself. Tehran has previously said it cannot negotiate with Washington, citing past strikes during negotiations over the past 2 years. As the Iranian military spokesperson mocked U.S. attempts at a ceasefire deal, insisting Americans were only negotiating with themselves, the Trump administration has reportedly sent a 15-point ceasefire plan to Iran through Islamabad. This was later confirmed to the Associated Press by Pakistani officials.
The US reportedly has sent Iran a 15-point plan aimed at resolving the conflict in the Middle East, the report said Tuesday. The New York Times, citing two officials briefed on the diplomacy, said the proposal outlined steps addressing Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile programs, as well as maritime security in the Strait of Hormuz. Israel's Channel 12 reveals some details of 15-point plan. It includes the dismantling of all existing Iranian nuclear capabilities and a commitment. According to source, there would be no production of weapons-grade nuclear material on Iranian soil, and all enriched material would be handed over to the International Atomic Energy Agency within an agreed timeline. It said Iran's Natanz, Isfahan and Fordow nuclear sites would be decommissioned and destroyed, and the IAEA would get full access to all information in regards to Iran's nuclear program, adding that Iran would cease the funding, directing and arming of its proxies in the region. In addition, the Strait of Hormuz will remain open and a free maritime zone, and no one will block it. The ceasefire plan was submitted to Iran by intermediaries from Pakistan, who have offered to host renewed negotiations between Washington and Tehran. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif said Pakistan stands ready to be the host to facilitate meaningful and conclusive talks for a comprehensive settlement of the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. The proposal comes as the US military is preparing to call up at least 1,000 more troops from the 82nd Airborne Division to supplement some 50,000 troops already in the region. It's the latest addition of American troops after US officials last week said thousands of Marines aboard several Navy ships will be heading to the region. Iran's reaction remains unclear. Tehran has denied that any negotiations are taking place, even as Donald Trump delays his self-imposed deadline for Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. The country's chokehold on the crucial waterway has snarled international shipping, sent fuel prices soaring, and raised fears for the global economy.
Armed boats attempted to intercept.
Meanwhile, U.S. officials are saying Iran's leadership structure is in chaos, with uncertainty surrounding Mojtaba Khamenei, who they believe to be dead or seriously injured after the strikes that killed his father, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Donald Trump has rejected him as a legitimate successor and is pressing Tehran towards urgent peace talks. A News' Ubay Shabander reports from Washington.
U.S. officials say that the Iranian government is facing major internal chaos and significant challenges in communicating within what is left of the Islamic Republic's leadership structure. President Trump said that he does not consider Mujtaba Khamenei, the son of the late Ayatollah Khamenei, was killed by American and Israeli strikes, as the legitimate new leader. Mujtaba Khamenei has not publicly revealed himself and is believed to be either dead or severely injured due to the strikes that killed his father. The Trump administration is pushing Tehran for in-person peace talks that could take place in Pakistan this week. Trump has said that Iran must agree to move all highly enriched uranium out of the country and permanently shut down any remaining nuclear enrichment capabilities. The offer for talks could prove to be the first major opportunity to end the conflict. President Trump has said that the administration would be willing to work with the Iranian Speaker of Parliament, Mohammad Ghalibaf. In the meantime, the U.S. continues to pour in additional reinforcements into the region, including thousands of more troops. Another major demand by the U.S., Iran must agree to the establishment of a free maritime zone in the Strait of Hormuz. Iran is believed to have launched drone attacks against ships carrying crude oil in the Strait of Hormuz, as well as laying undersea mines. Trump told reporters that he believes that the U.S. has largely won the conflict and managed to achieve a form of regime change in Iran. Mubi Shabander, A News, Washington.
As global fuel supply chains remain disrupted due to the Iran war, the Philippines became the first country to formally declare a national energy emergency in response to soaring fuel prices. A host of other countries are also implementing measures.
In the Philippines, President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has declared a state of national energy emergency, warning of an imminent danger to the country's energy supply as the Middle East conflict continues to disrupt global markets. A government task force has been formed to ensure the supply and distribution of fuel and other essential goods, while authorities have been granted emergency powers to secure imports and stabilize availability. The measure will remain in effect for 1 year amid rising oil prices and mounting supply chain risks. Japan is stepping up emergency measures, with Sanai Takaichi announcing the release of national oil reserves from Thursday to offset supply disruptions as part of a coordinated effort with the International Energy Agency. Global oil prices have surged to their highest since 2022 following strikes on Iran, while the closure of the Strait of Hormuz continues to disrupt key shipments. Across regions, the effects of the crisis are increasingly being felt. In Kenya, the fuel sector is under pressure, with retailers reporting supply gaps affecting around a fifth of outlets as global shortages filter into local markets.
Because of the crisis that we are getting ourselves into, the markets react to the realities, not the arrangements. And so the realities are there's a supply gap.
In Chile, long queues have formed at fuel stations as motorists rush to fill up ahead of expected sharp price increases, adding strain on already stretched households.
This is hitting us very hard. We depend on fuel, and we are going to do our best to make sure this price hike does not get passed on to the parents, because things are already tough enough as it is.
Meanwhile, in Slovenia, the government has introduced limits on fuel purchases to curb hoarding and ease pressure on supplies. Drivers are now restricted to fixed daily amounts. As the conflict involving Iran continues to disrupt key global shipping routes, energy pressures are now spreading further across Asia. India is seeing surging fuel demand, with long queues and delays at petrol stations amid panic buying, while China is also witnessing motorists lining up ahead of expected price increases as global oil costs climb. The aviation sector is increasingly affected, with airlines cutting flights and raising fares as fuel prices surge, with warnings of billions of dollars in additional costs if the situation persists.
Away from the Middle East conflict, Cuba is facing its own mounting energy and economic crisis due to a U.S. oil blockade. Humanitarian aid is now reaching Havana by sea, as the Caribbean nation's president said no fuel had entered Cuba in 3 months.
A humanitarian flotilla carrying 30 tons of aid has arrived in Havana as the country faces a deepening energy and economic crisis. The vessel, named Maguro, docked on Tuesday along the Malecon promenade, where officials and activists gathered to welcome the shipment. It is part of the three-ship Nuestra America convoy, which set sail from Mexico's port of Progreso on March 20th, with carrying medical supplies, solar panels, and non-perishable food collected by solidarity groups. Volunteers and local workers began unloading the supplies shortly after arrival, with 2 more ships expected in the coming days.
This is an immense emotion for us being here because we know Cuba is the most solidarity-driven country in the world. We come in return, a country that sent medical brigades, teachers, and made so many gestures of solidarity, now needs our support.
A day earlier, a Mexican Navy ship, the Huasteco, left Veracruz carrying additional humanitarian aid as Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum pledged support and explored fuel supplies to Cuba, despite tariff warnings from Donald Trump.
I know both very well.
Cuba's growing dependence on aid follows months of severe fuel shortages. In January, Washington moved to cut off Venezuelan oil exports to the island after taking action against Nicolas Maduro. Venezuela had long supplied Cuba with oil on favorable terms, making the sudden halt a major blow. Since then, Cuba's energy system has come under intense pressure. The national grid collapsed twice in a single week, leaving large parts of Havana without power.
Besides the fact that there's no food, there are thousands of resources that don't exist in this country. Now with these blackouts, the little food people have spoils, and you don't know what to do anymore. You don't know if you can buy food for a month, or for a week, or for a day, because you never know when the electricity will go out. 1 minute, everything is lit up, and the next minute, everything goes down.
While electricity has been partly restored, prolonged blackouts remain common. With fuel scarce and infrastructure stretched, the island is now increasingly dependent on international aid shipments to ease the crisis.
Over in Europe, Denmark faces a period of political uncertainty after a tightly contested parliamentary election left no clear majority. Despite losses for Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen's Social Democrats, coalition talks will now decide who forms the next government. Frederiksen called the vote months earlier than expected after a standoff with Donald Trump over the future of Danish semi-autonomous territory of Greenland.
Mette Frederiksen's Social Democrats recorded their worst election result in more than a century in Denmark's parliamentary vote on March 24th, according to final projections. The centre-left party, in power since 2019, won around 38 seats in the 179-member Danish parliament, down from 50 in the previous election. Despite the setback, Frederiksen said she is ready to remain in office, though forming a new government is expected to take time.
In modern times, with 12 parties in the Folketing Danish parliament, it is still this party, our party, that is able to embrace people, high and low, young and old, city and country, and we reach out. We reach out for responsibility, even when it comes at a price. We have always done that, and we will continue to do that, and I am still ready to take on responsibility as Denmark's Prime Minister.
The election was largely shaped by domestic issues, with voters focused on the rising cost of living, welfare and pensions, overshadowing foreign policy achievements. This came despite Frederiksen's firm stance against Donald Trump over Greenland and her strong support for Ukraine. Results showed the left-leaning bloc slightly ahead with about 84 seats compared to 77 for right-wing parties, but neither side secured a clear majority in Parliament. Centrist leader and Foreign Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen emerged as a key figure, with his moderates party likely to play a decisive role in coalition talks. He called for unity, stressing the need for cooperation in an increasingly uncertain global environment. Frederiksen had called the election early in an attempt to strengthen her mandate, But analysts say economic concerns and voter fatigue after nearly 7 years in power contributed to the party's historic decline. Coalition negotiations are now expected to determine whether she can secure a third term.
Turning to the war in Ukraine, Kyiv reported shooting down more than 1,000 drones in the span of 24 hours, calling it one of the heaviest air attacks since the start of the war. The 17th century St. Andrew's Church in Lviv, part of a UNESCO World Heritage Site, also came under a Russian attack, Ukraine's Prime Minister Yulia Sviridenko has said. Russia's defense ministry said its forces struck Ukrainian military and industrial sites, airfields and other targets, and also claimed it downed hundreds of Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicles. The attacks show that Russia has no real intention of seeking peace, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has said. He called for increased international pressure on Russia, warning that only strong action and significant losses could push Kremlin to end the war.
The scale of this attack clearly shows that Russia has no real intention of ending this war. And considering that Russia is also helping the Iranian regime carry out strikes across the region, the conclusion is obvious. Without additional and strong pressure on Russia, without tangible losses for them there in Moscow, they will not develop any desire to move away from the war or return to peace. It is precisely pressure that is currently lacking. On the contrary, there are signals encouraging Russia to continue what they have been doing for years, only increasing aggression. The partial easing of sanctions against Russia works in Russia's interest to continue the war. Russians will earn at least $2 billion in just these weeks from the easing of sanctions.
Authorities in Estonia say a Russian drone struck a chimney at a local power station, with no injuries reported and no damage to the facility. The incident occurred around the same time a Ukrainian drone attack set fire to oil facilities at Russia's Baltic Sea port of Ust-Luga. Latvian authorities also said 2 drones crossed into the country's airspace, one from Russia and the other from Belarus. Amid a constant stream of news from the wars in Europe and the Middle East, some industries are adapting. German giant Volkswagen is reportedly exploring turning some of its manufacturing capacity from cars to missiles. Anita Sharma has more.
Welcome to This Day in Europe, where Volkswagen is reportedly exploring a big shift from building cars to producing missile defense systems. The Financial Times says the German automaker is in talks with Israel's Iron Dome manufacturer to repurpose at least one factory for defense production. If the deal goes through, the troubled Volkswagen plant in the northwestern city of Osnabrück would transition from traditional automotive output into the rapidly growing defense sector. Volkswagen is already in a joint venture between subsidiary truck manufacturer MAN and German arms group Rheinmetall to make military vehicles. A deal with Rafael Advanced Defense Systems would mark a strategic pivot for Europe's largest car maker, which has been suffering from weak demand, rising costs, and intensifying competition, particularly in EVs. Production could start in a year, with the Osnabrück plant making various Iron Dome parts, while Rafael is reportedly planning a separate production facility in Germany for the system's missiles, which must be handled on a specialist site. Rafael apparently sees potential to sell the Iron Dome system to governments across Europe as the continent tries to boost its air defenses amid Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. However, questions remain about whether the Iron Dome is suited to Europe's needs. Experts say effective defense against airborne threats requires a layered system coordinated across multiple countries. In that context, Iron Dome's role may depend less on what it can do and more on how well it can be integrated. Because in Europe's defense, capability alone is not enough. Coordination is everything. For A News, I'm Anita Sharma in Arnhem, Netherlands.
All right, after a short break, we will be taking a closer look at the latest developments in the U.S. and Israel war with Iran. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Now, with Iran saying the U.S. is negotiating with itself and Washington reportedly sending a 15-point peace plan to Tehran via intermediaries, joining us to take a closer look at the latest developments is political analyst Anna Evans, coming to us from Lisbon. Anna, welcome. Great to have you on the program, as always. With these messages we've been hearing in the past few days, it kind of doesn't seem that Washington and Tehran are talking about the same war. What do you make of these conflicting narratives?
Well, it is part of the strategic counter-narratives of war. We know that war is fought on the field, but war is also fought in communication, especially global communication. And so none of the parties at war is interested in revealing its strategy, for the next stages. And therefore, it is very natural that Iran tries to play down Washington's 15-point peace plan, and that Washington says something different. Furthermore, it is actually very natural that we hear conflicting messages from the American side. So when people seem perplexed because President Trump says one thing and then his advisors say something else, that's also part of the counter-narratives, that are specifically aimed to not being transparent in terms of what the war parties are planning for the next steps.
Now, when it comes to that peace plan, the U.S. proposition, Pakistani officials told Associated Press that the plan has been delivered to the Iranians. Now, we've seen these Trump multiple-point peace plans. Sometimes they go right, but sometimes they do not. Do you expect Iran to be receptive of Trump's ideas here?
Well, it certainly doesn't look like Tehran will be receptive of the Trump administration's ideas, because in its very essence, the 15-point peace plan resembles previous negotiations. So negotiations that were already being held, before the war, and that always failed. And so basically this plan predicts or foresees that Iran would completely dismantle its nuclear military production, so the enrichment of uranium would completely stop, and all uranium enrichment capacity would be dismantled. In exchange, the US would create some form of offsite, meaning away from Iran, production of civil nuclear capacity that would then be provided to Iran. Also, the plan foresees that Iran should completely stop producing long-range missiles, ballistic missiles, and would have a limited authorization for production of shorter-range ballistic missiles. And so basically, the air capacity of Iran would be very much dismantled, and its nuclear capacity would be basically eliminated. Furthermore, the plan foresees that Iran should commit to a total disengagement with regard to the axis of resistance, meaning with regard to Iran's, decades support to proxies that have created instability throughout the Middle East. And so these are very, very comprehensive demands from the US side, and therefore Iran has always resisted this sort of all or nothing approach, zero-sum approach, and Iran has always requested in the negotiations for tiny slices in terms of consensus. And so it doesn't look like Iran has changed its position, notwithstanding the fact that now the US demands are backed, by force, by the military attacks which have been conducted over the past 4 weeks.
Exactly as you've put it, there is a lot in that plan. We've also been hearing reports that thousands more Marines, sailors, paratroopers are on their way to the Middle East. At the current circumstances, do you see leadership in Iran, whoever that may be right now, as maybe being willing to negotiate all of this in one go?
It doesn't look like, Andy, because, that would amount to surrender. And, for the leadership in Iran at this stage, the number one concern is regime survival. And so if the regime consensualized with the US on the 15-point plan in a visible way, that would politically be untenable. That would amount to defeat. And, in a war, with the war going on, with so much destruction of already naval air capacities, nuclear infrastructures, and so much show of force from both US and Israel, the Iranian regime cannot afford to look feeble. Furthermore, Khamenei was immediately killed. Several leaders have been decapitated throughout the war. And so it would really amount to complete surrender if Iran now, publicly allowed for some concessions that were evident. So even if there will be some form of negotiation or of effective goal negotiation, it will have to be very thin slices of the issues at stake, and it would have to be in a way that Iran can domestically, the regime can domestically still state it is victorious. And so it inevitably needs to move forward in a path where Iran can claim victory, even if obviously that is not the case.
Anna, how about the other side? We've heard both American and Israeli officials basically saying that this war is won. What do you see as a possible off-ramp for Washington? What can Trump point to and say, all right, mission accomplished, the operation ends now?
Well, it is much easier for the US administration to go out of this war than it is for either Israel or Iran. That is a fact, because the US is certainly the less dependent party on the evolution of the war. So the war is an existential threat for Israel. It is also an existential threat for the regime of Iran, but it is not for the US. And so what the US is now doing is trying to contain damage on the global economy and trying to resume normality with regard to energy flows. And so the US, for example, the administration, President Trump, has allowed for an exception to rules on navigation on American ports, which now can be approached by ships from other countries than just the US. And President Trump, obviously, and his administration are conducting intense diplomacy, at the regional level to tame, the Arab Gulf countries' possible response and to remain, to keep the region, without boiling up to the point of total war. So for President Trump, it is relatively easy to say we have destructed a lot of nuclear infrastructures, a lot of Iran's naval capacity, a lot of Iran's aerial capacity, air capacity, and also defense systems and the capacity to produce missiles. And so we've already accomplished a great part of what we set to do, which is to dismantle as much as possible the foreign military reach of the country. And so in that sense, it's much easier for President Trump to move out than for the other parties.
In that vein, as you so rightly pointed out, that this war carries more significance and impact for both Israel and Iran. Do you see the United States as having the capability of exerting enough pressure on Israel to not derail any possible peace arrangements made between Washington and Tehran?
Well, the US is a really important partner here, right? So the US had already been an important partner in June last year, when the first attacks on nuclear infrastructures were carried out, US and Israel. And so the countries the US backs up Israel in many ways, both in air, in the air capacity and defense capacity, and in its, very complex presence in the region. And so obviously, if the US moves out, that is a major change in the strategy of the war and in what will happen next. Having said that, we also know that Israel has massive military capacity, and Israel has shown that it can't tolerate any existential threats. And so obviously, even if the US goes out of the turf, Israel can still strike. So what this means is that in essence, this is, and it has been since the first June strikes last year, it has been a coordinated approach. And that means that the US has a lot of leverage on what it reasons should be Israel's approach, but it does not have total leverage. There is always some margin for acts of war that are single-handedly responsibility of Israel and without full agreement by the US. So those are a marginal part of these coalitions, so the part that can go on its own, but it is possible that this could happen, that Israel could do, and it has already done, acts of war that are not fully in compliance with the US.
Anna, thank you so much for joining us and providing us with your insight and analysis.
A pleasure.
Now, after a short break, we will be taking a look at the major stories out of the region. Welcome back. Afghanistan has released an American citizen who had been detained for more than a year, describing the move as a humanitarian gesture during the Eid al-Fitr holiday. The release came following appeals by the American's family and international coordination. Our correspondent Tamim Bahes has the details in Kabul.
The Afghan Ministry of Foreign Affairs says American national Dennis Coyle has been released on humanitarian grounds after the country's Supreme Court ruled that the time he had already served was sufficient. Officials say the decision came after a request from his family, particularly his mother, seeking clemency ahead of Eid al-Fitr. And he was later handed over to his family and a U.S. delegation in Kabul. Afghan Foreign Minister Amir Khan Muttaqi also met in Kabul with former U.S. Special Representative Zalmay Khalilzad, UAE Ambassador Saif al-Katbi, and a representative of the detainees' family. During the meeting, Muttaqi said foreign nationals are detained only for violations of Afghan laws and released after judicial procedures are completed, adding that Afghanistan is ready to improve consular cooperation. Authorities thanked the UAE for helping facilitate the release and also acknowledged Qatar's role in supporting communication between officials and the detainees' family. U.S. officials confirmed that the release came without any deal or payment, while welcoming the move, but noting that Washington is still seeking the return of other detained Americans. Tamim Bahes in Kabul, A News.
Turkey says natural gas deliveries from Iran are continuing, despite reports of a disruption following strikes on Iran's largest gas field. Adam Morrow has more on that in Istanbul.
Turkish Energy Minister Alparslan Bayraktar has denied reports that natural gas flows from Iran to Turkey had been halted, saying deliveries were continuing and supply remained secure. Speaking to reporters after a Tuesday cabinet meeting, Bayraktar said Iranian gas flows to Turkey were ongoing, adding that the country's storage facilities were currently about 71% full. Earlier the same day, Bloomberg had cited unnamed sources as saying that Iranian gas exports to Turkey had been halted following Israeli-U.S. strikes on Iran's South Pars gas field. Iran is one of Turkey's key gas suppliers, typically accounting for between 10 and 15% of annual imports. The two countries are linked via the Tabriz-Ankara pipeline, which has historically provided an important share of Turkey's wintertime gas supply, although Turkey also imports large volumes of liquefied natural gas from both Russia and Azerbaijan. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, meanwhile, has said the ongoing closure of the Strait of Hormuz has caused significant disruptions to the global economy. Speaking to reporters in Ankara, he said the international system was undergoing what he described as fundamental change, with the emergence of what he called new alliances. Erdogan added that Turkey was navigating the regional conflict cautiously and was determined to avoid being drawn into what he called a ring of fire. Since the regional conflict began last month, Iran has effectively restricted shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, saying that what it describes as non-hostile vessels may transit the strait if they coordinate with Iranian authorities. According to Turkish officials, at least one Turkish-owned ship has been permitted to pass through the strait, while a number of others are still awaiting Tehran's permission to transit the strategic waterway. This is Adam Morrow for A News in Istanbul, Turkey.
A new batch of grain from Russia to Armenia is making its way through Azerbaijan. 5 wagons carrying 350 tons of wheat passed Azerbaijan's Bilajari station. The train is en route to Georgia before continuing towards Armenia. To date, more than 23,000 tons of grain, around 1,000 tons of fertilizer, and 68 tons of buckwheat have been shipped by train from Russia to Armenia via Azerbaijan. Kazakhstan says it is ready to deepen energy cooperation with the United States by expanding export routes across the Caspian Sea and boosting investment. Kazakhstan's energy minister made the remarks during talks with U.S. Energy Secretary Chris Wright on the sidelines of an event in Houston. The two spoke on energy security, alternative corridors, and the Caspian region's role in global supply chains. U.S. investment in Kazakhstan's energy sector has now exceeded $60 billion, with major projects involving ExxonMobil and Chevron. A new Eurasian Development Bank report warns that Central Asia's energy systems remain highly vulnerable as heavy reliance on single energy sources combines with growing climate risks across the region. A News' Sevilla Rajapova reports from Tashkent.
A new analysis by the Eurasian Development Bank shows that between 60 and 90% of electricity in Central Asian countries is generated from a single source, creating structural vulnerabilities in the region's energy systems. In hydropower-dependent countries such as Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, decline in water levels during dry seasons have led to reduced electricity generation and winter shortages. In 2024, Kyrgyzstan was forced to import up to 25% of its electricity due to increased demand and lower hydropower output, while Tajikistan has relied on rolling blackouts to manage supply gaps. In Uzbekistan and other resource-rich states, the challenge lies in over-reliance on gas-fired generations. During extreme cold in January 2023, a surge in demand led to pressure drops in gas networks, causing outages at several power plants and widespread disruptions. Experts warn that climate change is further intensifying these risks. According to the World Meteorological Organization, global temperatures are now around 1.43 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, while glacial melt in Central Asia is accelerating, threatening long-term water supplies that are critical for both energy and agriculture. The region is already experiencing more frequent and extreme weather events, including droughts and floods, which are placing additional pressure on energy infrastructure and water resources. Analysts say diversifying energy sources, including expanding renewable energy and improving regional cooperation, will be key to strengthening resilience and ensuring long-term energy security across Central Asia. It is Sevilla Rajapova reporting from Tashkent, Uzbekistan, A-News.
Well, that's all we have for you for now. Thank you so much for watching and stay tuned to A News.